Hey, what's up?
Hey, how's it going? Is this the Destiny Socialism Power Hour?
Um, no, please God, no.
Um, I'm gonna segue into socialism, but I wanted to start with talking about utilitarianism a bit. Um,
Okay.
because you're looking at things through a consequentialist framework, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. What kind of so imagine that we're measuring happiness, right? What kind of output are we looking at? Are we looking
I
at
have
net
no idea.
happiness,
That's an insanely complicated question to answer.
median, mode? What are you looking at?
Well,
What do you
it's
want
not
to
so much, it's not
maximize?
the way that we measure it, it's what the variable we measure. Like, do we measure it in mental illness? Do we do
Mhm.
self reported job satisfaction? Do we do educational attainment? Do we do people's happiness with their families? Like, I don't know how you would engage with
Um,
hobbies. Like,
Okay, so for example, a way that people sometimes when they do studies like this to measure happiness
hmm
based off income, they do self-reported satisfaction. And that's like just with their lives in general as it pertains to their income, right? So for a number like this, are you trying to get net happiness? So if you have a billionaire who is very, very happy with themselves, is that worth like 10 poor people who are not so happy? Or would you try to even this out a bit?
no, it would be like a veil of ignorance thing, right? You'd try to probably even it out throughout society. Like, I would rather have like 10 people of like, if I could rate happiness on a scale from 1 to 10, I'd rather have 10 people at a 7 than like one person at like a 15 and then like
Okay.
the other 9 people at like a 3 or something, right? Yeah.
Excellent. Are you aware of the research that basically posits it's always on the internet? Basically, the idea is that after about 70K, people tend to peak out on happiness per like income increases, right?
Yeah, I've heard this, yeah.
Yeah, because generally you fulfill your basic needs and shit. Um, so by that logic, right, the idea that generally after a certain amount of money, more the happiness you get from more money doesn't really tend to
Yeah, it's a
be
diminishing
so
return
significant.
or
Yeah,
marginal
of
utility and
course.
shit, right?
Shouldn't you be supportive generally of redistributive policy,
Yeah,
like
I'm
across
very
the board?
supportive of redistributive policy, yeah.
Cool. In terms of, because oftentimes you talk about efficiency, right, in these kinds of policies, and especially when we talk about things like socialism, you cite that well, a capitalist solution might be more efficient, right, even if these things might be beneficial
I
to
don't know if I would
workers or
say
whatever.
like efficient or effective, but sure. Those might be kind of the
Uh,
same thing, but yeah.
would you allow for like say a GDP decrease for a happiness like satisfaction increase in the lives of American citizens or whoever?
I don't know if those things would go hand in hand, but probably, yeah.
Okay,
Like if
all
there
right,
was a way,
cool.
for instance, to provide like social health care to everybody, and
Mhm.
like you're not like fucking over like parts of the country, but it like led to a small decrease in GDP or something, or a decrease in GDP, yeah, I'd probably be okay with that.
Okay, because I'm not suggesting we like destroy the economy or something. What I hear a lot from liberal types, um, like Dan, is typically like, oh well, GDP is like really important, et cetera, et cetera. Like we really don't want to like, why would we do these things that are beneficial if we're going to decrease GDP?
Yeah, I guess it would just depend on how much damage you're doing to the economy.
Absolutely, I would never, it'd probably be a bad idea to fucking absolutely destroy the economy, right? Because it doesn't really matter how much money you'd make at that point.
Sure. Like a white nationalist, well, like somebody that supports an ethno state would be okay taking severe hits to the economy to support their ideology for people like that. So, I'm not
Yeah.
comparing it to that, but like some people, well, a lot of people today, especially, I guess, like populists would say that, like, well, the overall health of like the economy is, largely predicated on the success of mega multinational conglomerates, and that doesn't represent like the average person's happiness anyway. So fuck that shit, right?
Mhm. Earlier, you said worker cooperatives wouldn't have investors. That's like kind of incorrect. A
How would
worker
they?
cooperative. Sure. So let's say a worker cooperative, like you have five boys together, and
hmm
they're like, "We're going to start our cooperative. We need capital." They could go to a publicly owned bank, get a loan. Now, what they wouldn't do is like a Shark Tank situation where they offer a ownership of their company in exchange for a loan, because that would require a non-worker owning part of their company, right? What they could do is just take a loan out at a certain interest rate and then pay back the loan as a way of procuring capital.
I don't disagree that that could happen. I think I would take issue with your terminology, but that just might be my own ignorance.
What do
Like
you
if I
mean?
were to start a small business and someone was like,
Mhm.
"Do you have any investors?" I don't think I would say like, "Oh yeah, Wells Fargo is an investor," and they go, "Oh really? Yeah, I got an SBA loan." Like it just seems kind of like semantically incorrect. I could be wrong though. That just does that really count? If you take a loan out, does that the person you get a loan from does that count as an investment?
Yes.
Oh,
Is it?
okay. I didn't know
Is
that.
it not?
I
I'm
guess
confused
usually
because that's
when I think of an investment from somebody, an investment seems to be an exchange of money for either a percentage share of ownership in your business or like a promise of future royalties or something.
Well, that's like generally the case, but that's just our structure of investment, right?
Okay.
That's not all investments are, you know. Because the reason why people offer up shares is because that's generally all you have to offer in exchange, right?
Wait,
Because
say
like,
that last thing again.
you offer up a share of your company because that's generally all you have to offer in exchange. People are looking for not only just a return on loan, they're looking for future gains, and additionally, they want a large enough gain to balance out losses from other loans, right? Because if you give
Mm-hmm.
out a certain number of loans, of course, over time you're going to have losses.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
But yeah,
well, I mean.
like as it exists today, people do procure loans.
Okay, sure.
Like
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree that you could take out a loan then, of course, sure.
okay, awesome. You talked to that last guy about foreign intervention, and I think he came up a little short
Mm-hmm.
on how a socialist society would discourage foreign intervention. And I think a pretty good example is basically how the for-profit media drives America towards war. Absolutely. And the reason why I think a lot of Americans support
Wait,
war.
real quick. Hold on. So, under your form, because everybody has like a different form of socialism. So, in
Yep.
your form of socialism, businesses don't make profit.
Well, not necessarily. I think there are some industries that should be socialized, right?
Okay.
Like
Well,
the
wait. So,
media,
this whole argument you're about to make has nothing to do with socialism, then, right? Because I can sit here and agree with you and say I don't think media should be for profit, but that doesn't mean I have to move away from capitalism. This would just be an industry
Okay,
that.
cool.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you just want to toss another coin in like the sliding towards socialism bucket and just like bite the bullet and say, well, media shouldn't be for profit in the first place, that's fine.
Okay.
Cool with
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
Um, another topic about foreign intervention is probably that like socialists generally are very, very forgiving on immigration, right? Even towards the extent of not having borders at all. That would
I don't think
absolutely.
that's true at all. I think that right now progressives are the ones that tend to be socialists. But if you watch that like Steven Crowder debate with fuck, what was that Youssef kid or whatever? Like that's an example of like you can have people that are socialists but are still like nationalistic and still anti-immigration and whatnot. Like those two ideologies have nothing to do with one another, I think.
I wouldn't say that that's mainstream. I would argue that most socialist movements are international, and the idea of a socialist America that relies off of like the exploitation of other countries is probably self-defeating, right? Like, why would your
Um,
entire ideology be about, say, exploitation of the worker is bad, as long as unless it's somebody else's worker, right? I mean,
Well, so like let's say that you had a democratized workplace, and you guys
yep.
manufactured shoes, and you had the ability to import leather from another country that was far cheaper than what you could get in America. Why wouldn't the workers all vote themselves to do that?
Oh, well, there wouldn't be a reason, right? So the idea is that socialist ideology, not necessarily the practical implication of socialism on a worker level, right? So assuming you had socialists in office, they would put in place policies that encourage, for example, the sourcing of materials from America, if you're going to do that, or they would
Mm-hmm.
encourage trade deals that would say, well, if you want to sell your goods to America, you have to pay your workers like either a fair rate or the businesses or whatever that are importing these goods have to be owned by the workers, right?
Okay, I understand that point. That has nothing to do with socialism, though, right? This is just kind of like protectionism. Like you could do this under a capitalist economy as well, is to enforce.
Well, sure. Under a capitalist economy, you could absolutely institute a trade deal
Mm-hmm.
saying anything we import from your country has to be from a worker-owned, like mean of production.
Or the people at least have to be getting paid some wage or something. Sure.
Well, yeah, that would be the difference between a suck dem society versus a socialist one, right? Is would the trade deal say well-paid workers, or would the trade deal say worker-owned means of production?
Okay, sure.
Because that is the difference.
Okay.
Um, so I think socialist movements are generally more international. They encourage, like literally they do encourage like immigration and like being around people different than yourself, right? They aren't very like isolationist movements, especially as it pertains to Latin America. If we're
Mm,
talking about foreign intervention down there.
okay. I don't really see why. I don't. I don't really see why socialism has to go hand in hand with like being inclusive or diverse. I feel like you can still have a bunch of like if I were to create worker co-ops in like Louisiana and rural Louisiana, I don't think that like a whole bunch of like white southern like farmers and rural people would be like, "Oh yeah, we should vote to give, to have greater like black people representation of the workplace." I feel like these things don't necessarily go hand in hand.
Interesting. You use Louisiana, a southern state with like tons of black people, but
Where black people are super fucking hated too. I mean, it's not, I mean,
true.
I mean, like for the first time, yeah,
so
go
the
ahead.
but so like my point is generally like so when we're talking about a socialist society,
Mm-hmm.
it's run like by people who are presumably socialists following socialist ideology. Now we can't
Well, like
make
the
it
problem,
a, 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 democracy, right?
yeah,
We can't
like
make
the
it
problem,
a democracy, right?
yeah, the problem that I have is like you say socialist, but I feel like what you mean is like altruistic. Like people will say things like, "Oh, well, they're run with socialist policies." I'm like, okay, well, what kind of social policies? Well, like being inclusive towards people of other races. Well, that has nothing to do
Hmm.
with socialism. Like,
Well, the entire ideology of communism and by extension socialism is that of egalitarianism, right? Everyone according to their
well,
ability
but
to everyone according to their ability.
but egalitarianism in regards to class struggle, not egalitarianism in regards to like race or even gender.
So
No.
in the past, you may have been correct
Uh huh.
because some communist and socialist movements were very exclusive, but in the past 100 years, they've been standing in solidarity with feminist causes, with LGBTQ causes, with Black liberation. The Black Panthers in America were largely Maoists, right? These things are highly intersectional, and in the past, 100 years or so, all of these movements have been standing in solidarity. Now, you are correct that there is existing like nationalist socialist movements. I think like national Bolsheviks, like Nazbols is like the meme,
Mm-hmm.
where you basically have like they're kind of like alt right lefties. As far as I'm aware, I'm not like super educated on it, but those are largely fringe movements, and like the end goal of a socialist or communist movement is to be egalitarian in not just class but also
Do you
other
okay? So
things.
like, I'm not trying to appeal to the past again, but like, do you think that like oh no, okay. So you already said that like people of the past that were like
Mhm.
lefties weren't necessarily like would Karl Marx have been somebody that loved black people and thought that women should work and whatnot?
It depends. Like the USSR, for example, had like really, really high rates of like women in education and in science, right? Working in their industries. And this was partially driven by like the death of a fuck ton of people in war. But I mean, they didn't like tank their economy to hold up their sexism, right? So I mean, you have examples of it being more accepting. You have examples of it being less accepting. I mean, it depends on where you look. China, Russia.
Mm-hmm.
But in more recent history, it's absolutely been standing in
In
solidarity.
more recent history, yeah. Recently, it seems like progressive, at least in the United States, like progressivism is what tends to get tied in with like socialism and whatnot. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
because I mean, if you look at MLK and like the Poor People's Campaign, that was a very socialist movement, right? And these things kind of stand in hand.
Okay.
Um, and then back on to round back to foreign intervention. Um, I think the education system in America, like K through 12, absolutely preaches American exceptionalism. Like you have kids very young in school learning about Christopher Columbus came over and they shook hands with the natives and everyone was happy and we settled the land and everything was all cool,
Mm-hmm.
right? We learn about all these super totally justified wars we get into, that kind of thing. And then once they get to university, the history class.
Oh my god! I just fucking tabbed over and Synergy just killed my fucking Discord.
Welcome back.
I'm sorry. Hello. Fucking shit. Bro.
It's
All
okay.
right. Sorry. Go ahead.
Once they get to university, the history classes and the like sociology classes are a bit more progressive in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, you have like the military industrial complex throwing huge amounts of money to recruit people straight out of university, not history majors or philosophy majors, but like business majors, engineers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Physics majors getting huge grants from the U.S. government to go work on weapons of war. These things are all like pretty intertwined, right?
Okay.
And I think in a socialist society, one that values, socialist ethical values, right, would say that like, hey, this amount of money, not just like this rent-seeking behavior is not only unacceptable in government, it's unacceptable in education too, right? You shouldn't have these big companies going, Lockheed Martin, whoever, throwing large amounts of cash at universities to set up a school to, missile factory pipeline, essentially, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I just thought I'd throw this out there.
Is this not something that people could do in a socialist system as well, though?
Or you mean a capitalist system?
No, in a socialist system, like couldn't like let's say Lockheed was like a worker co-op, like couldn't they invest money into schools to have children educated to come immediately to their co-op and whatnot?
Well, sure, but the point is that would be in direct conflict with the values of the uh, political system as a whole,
I
right?
feel like so like I agree with. Well, no, I don't agree with anything you're saying. I guess
Okay.
like so basically it feels like you're doing like what every socialist I talk to does, where like you're
Hmm.
trying to sell me on socialism, but you're not actually selling me on socialism. You're selling me on this egalitarian altruistic
Yep.
society that is like so good. And like if these people were capitalists, like it would work just as well, right? Like you would say, like in your world you'd say like, well, a socialist society would have the values that would be inclusive of people of all shapes and sizes, blah blah blah. And I would say, well, in my ideal capitalist society, people like Bezos and Bill Gates would volunteer every Saturday, and donate $100 million every week to homeless shelters and get people out. Like I would say the same thing about like a capitalist society. Like
So would you say certain political and economic systems are based off of certain values? Like, would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, like I would say that like this is like way past my, but it feels to me like capitalism is probably something that springs out of like liberalism. It feels like it's a natural extension of that.
Yeah, like the individual
Yeah, the
freedom
individual
to be a
rights, free,
rational
economic freedom,
consumer, et
private
cetera, et
property.
cetera.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like socialism or communism would spring out of like the ethical values of like egalitarianism, being equal, et cetera, et cetera.
Well,
Um,
but okay, so like, oh man, this is so far outside of my political fucking knowledge, what I should be talking about. But like,
okay.
when you say egalitarianism, when you say socialism is egalitarianism, it feels like the definition that you're appealing to that is like what we think egalitarianism is. And egalitarianism, when we say it in today's speech, is like, you know, all people are treated as equally as possible. So women, black people, blah, 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 blah. But egalitarianism to like a Marxist is generally concerned with the analysis of classes of like the proletariat, the bourgeois, not necessarily like black people or women. So I don't know if it's fair to say that like, oh, well, egalitarianism is the underlying philosophy of Marxism, when what you're really talking about is egalitarianism of the classes, not of like every size, shape, creed, and religious denomination or whatever of people.
I mean, and you'd be correct, but Marxism is not just like Marx didn't write the book, like he didn't just write Capital, and everyone was like, "This is Marxism, it's done," right? It's evolved over time, like
Sure.
the political perspective of Marxists has evolved
Mm-hmm.
to include intersectionality, right? It's like
Well, wait,
like
you
we
would say that Marxism like necessarily? I thought intersectionality was more like a social analysis.
So egalitarianism, like the idea of being egalitarian, would suggest that everyone is equal, not just from a class perspective, right? Like if we take
Yeah,
away
how we
from
use
Marx,
egalitarianism today. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
not just today, even if Plato or whoever was talking about being egalitarian. I mean, if the idea is that everyone is equal, then
I
that would
don't. There's no way. I
there wouldn't
can't
be a
possibly agree
subtext.
with that.
Well, no, Plato. Okay, so let's say Plato himself wouldn't, because he thought everyone outside of Greece was like a fucking rancid
Well,
barbarian.
even like in our even in like our Declaration of Independence, like our Constitution, right? You find phrases like "all men are created equal," and that's egalitarian, but they didn't mean black people. I mean, right? Like,
okay, right, but the spirit of egalitarianism, not the application of it, right? If I go out and say I'm an egalitarian and I only make class equality and not racial equality, well, I'm just not living up to the spirit of egalitarianism, right? Like the ethical position of it. I agree with you that the implementation of egalitarianism and the evocation of its name has not been true to what it might mean. But what I'm saying is if we're going to, like, Marxist thought has evolved over time, over the last 200 years, to be more egalitarian than it once was, right? And while I agree,
I mean,
with
but
a lot
that's
of
true of
Marxists,
like capitalism as well, right?
more egalitarian, yeah, of course. But so the problem is if capitalism is at its most egalitarian, right, meaning all the women and the black people and like indigenous people, they all get fucked by capital equally, right? There's no more discrimination, no more wealth disparities.
Yeah, at least it's
et cetera, et cetera.
egalitarian, right?
Well, yes, but not completely so, right? Just like if Marxism evened out the class warfare and then locked a certain ethnic group in chains, it wouldn't be egalitarian either, right? So I wanna rewind way back to what I was trying to talk about like 10 minutes ago.
Okay.
Not your fault. So basically, my statement is that because certain political and economic systems are based out of certain values, it will create and then entrench systems that purport those values.
I agree with that. I think, yeah.
Okay, cool. So if we were to follow a Marxist ideology that valued egalitarianism in the way that we understand it today, I believe that it would create and then entrench systems that valued that. So if you had things like worker co-ops, right, violating those principles, they would probably receive backlash by either the public at large or the systems itself. Just like in capitalism, if you have things trying to violate the principles of capitalism, right? Like let's say someone wants to socialize healthcare. Well, the capitalists don't like that because it goes against their liberal, rational consumer mean, right? Like where we think every hospital is just a fucking grocery store and we go around and shop for the best steaks. Well, it kind of it violates that principle, so it's gonna be resistant to that. Just like in a Marxist system, if a Lockheed and Martin worker co-op decided to lobby the education system, well, that would be violating one of the ethical principles of the society at large, and there would be pushback to that, right?
Maybe.
Okay, and I like that maybe. And
Well,
so
like my problem is that like if I were to take the same group of people that were egalitarians were pushing socialism, and instead I were to make them capitalists, they could push like these same types of values, and I theoretically I could see it working. But yeah, okay.
But my point is that since the capitalist system reproduces itself, that shows up in education, right? And that produces more capitalists, right? Whereas if you have a Marxist system,
Sure, but if you're producing capitalists that were like egalitarians that believed in like protected classes and shit like that, then
then we'd still have like, you know, a lot of class exploitation, right?
Well, what do you mean by class exploitation?
Like you'd have capitalists fucking over workers consistently.
Well, what do you mean by fucking over? Like, are you like when you say that? Do you mean like all forms of labor is exploitative in an immoral way, or?
It doesn't have to be, but I mean, like for example, if I were to take the stance that all forms of labor are exploitative, that would mean
Mm-hmm.
if I'm a worker and I receive 99% of the value of my labor, that would be exploitation. I
Yeah.
don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, obviously there's scale here, but I mean, you don't get jobs where 99% of the value of your labor is yours, right?
Oh, well,
That doesn't
I do right
exist.
now as a Twitch streamer. I'm just fucking with you.
Well,
I'm sorry.
yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm not.
Well, actually, no, that's a very good point. I mean, you
No,
find
it's not. It's a
yourself
shit point because my
rewarding.
job is very exceptional. So never mind. But go ahead. Sorry.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's exceptional in today's society, right?
Yeah.
Like most positions in society don't allow.
Yeah,
that.
yeah. You get a very small percentage of the actual labor. Yeah.
Your lifestyle is the lifestyle that I want for everybody.
Thanks.
But the point is that generally, since the capital already exists, right? Like if you take away the capitalist, the capital doesn't necessarily go anywhere, depending.
Maybe, yeah. As long as it's
I mean, by
maintained
the way-
by the workers and everything and all that. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Which, by the way, the biggest problem with transitioning to a socialist or communist society is capital flight.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a serious economic issue. But assuming that we can solve that problem, right? The capital exists whether or not the capitalist is there to manage it, right?
I don't know if that's true, but I'll say yes. I mean, capital has to be maintained, right, and requires reinvestment and
Yeah.
whatnot. But
Absolutely. Which, I mean, once its ownership is transferred to the worker, I mean, that can happen.
it could
I think
happen.
I think my overall point was basically
Mhm.
just that if we, because you like to kind of hand wave the idea that in a socialist society, socialist structures would be upheld, and that we could probably do the same thing with socialist people or egalitarian people in a capitalist society.
Mhm.
But the problem is I'm focused on constructing structures that put out egalitarian people, right? And I think capitalism is bad for that because it puts out liberal people who
Okay.
think that everyone is a rational actor, right? Which is just not true
Sure.
in society. And yeah, and let's see. I'm just trying to think of what else I wanted to talk about. If there's anything else. Oh, do you want to end on a spicy one? I think
Sure.
reparations are a good idea.
I mean, if there's empirical data to back it up, I'd agree with you. There's not much else to say. Or do you just think philosophically it's a good idea?
Philosophically, it's a good idea.
Oh,
I like
I
that.
don't really care. I don't believe in like that something is like virtuous in and of itself. If it doesn't produce any good outcomes, just giving people a bunch of money, I don't think is necessarily a good thing.
So like not just about good outcomes. I think there's an interesting quote
Mhm.
by Malcolm X where it kind of talks about how the black community has like a knife in its back, and people are talking about ways to heal the wound before even pulling the knife out.
Mhm.
And I agree with you that cash reparations are largely pointless if we still have things like wealth inequalities and large gaps in healthcare and income and shit.
Yeah, or the fact that the average American is financially illiterate, so giving them a cash injection doesn't help their financial situation whatsoever. I think this is pretty evidenced by like tax return day, right? People usually get their tax returns and they go out and buy big TVs.
Yeah, exactly. And so do you think if we fixed these problems, that like the wealth inequalities, you know, financial illiteracy disparities, things like that, so everyone was on an equal playing field? I mean, obviously, giving them money would probably have a positive result in the economy, right?
A short-term, very temporary one, yeah.
Yeah.
Like any sort
I
of
mean, as long as
stimulus
we're not-
spending would.
Yeah, as long as we're not breaking the bank, it probably wouldn't have a long-term negative impact on the economy, depending on.
Depending on how you feel about like deficit spending, I guess. Sure.
So I mean, assuming that like the outcome would be positive, do you have any problems with it?
No, if the outcome is positive, then yeah, go for it.
Okay, so your only philosophical objection is that we're putting the cart before the horse or whatever?
Yeah, like if it didn't actually end up like if basically let's say we do like okay, well here are reparations, and then like every black person just wasted all the money immediately, and like they bought like a bunch of dumb shit, like what people normally do when they get big cash injections, then it'd be like okay, well what the fuck was the point of this?
Okay, sick. I'm done then.
Okay. Well, hey buddy, I love you. Be
Alright.
careful, okay?
Peace out. Stay safe. Love you too.
See you
Bye.
later.